Imagine you're walking through a room filled with wax figures of celebrities, historical icons, and even notorious criminals. When the space is filled with other tourists milling about and taking photos of their idols, it's not so bad. But once it's emptied out and you find yourself alone, you're all of a sudden aware of how the wax faces look almost too real. Their eyes seem to follow you as you move past. The air is deadly still, and then you hear it. A whisper. Soft, but unmistakable. And close. You look around, but the room is empty. There's not another living soul in there with you, but what about something else? We're talking about Madame Tussauds, museums that are famous around the world for their weirdly lifelike wax figures. But what if those figures aren't the only ones keeping watch? Because visitors have reported strange things happening in these museums. Full body apparitions appearing among the displays, disembodied voices echoing through the halls, and even wax figures moving when no one is looking. But it's not just one particular museum that this is happening in. There are multiple allegedly haunted Madame Tussauds museums, and we need to talk about it. So we need to start with Madame Tussauds herself, whose first name was Marie, because obviously this entire story wouldn't exist if it weren't for her. So Marie was born Marie Groschultz in 1761 in France. Unfortunately, her dad had died before she was even born, as he'd been a military man and he'd suffered some pretty brutal injuries in the 7 Years' War. I would probably get a slap on the wrist by the algorithm gods if I were to tell you what they actually were, because they were pretty brutal, but they're laid out right there in her memoirs if you've got a morbid curiosity like me. After her father died, obviously her mother needed to support herself and her children, so she took a job as a housekeeper for a physician called Philippe Curtius, who just so happened to be super skilled in the art of wax modelling. So from a very young age, she's being brought up around this talented guy, learning the ropes. And by the time she's 16, Marie was already creating wax sculptures for some of the most famous figures in history, like Voltaire in 1777. And by 1780, Marie's talent is getting attention. Her name is even being brought up in royal circles. She actually became the art tutor to King Louis XVI's sister, Elizabeth, and so got to live at Versailles for a while. But that would turn out to be an incredibly dangerous position to find yourself in, as her whole world was going to turn completely upside down in a few short years, because in 1789, the French Revolution started. Marie manages to get back to Paris the night before things all kick off, but it's still tense and bloody for the next few years. In 1793, Marie, her mother and her aunt were all imprisoned in the notorious La Force prison, accused of being royalists, and so they shared a cell with 20 other women from aristocratic backgrounds, including Josephine de Beauharnais, who you might recognise as the woman who went on to marry Napoleon Bonaparte a bit later on. They had no beds, they were forced to sleep on straw on the floor, the food was barely edible, and they were made to have their hair cut short each week, just in case they were called up to have a date with the guillotine, which they were told was a reasonably likely possibility. However, Marie and her family were released, but Marie was given a very important job to do, which would help to prove her loyalty to the revolution rather than the aristocrats who she was associated with. She was made to create death masks of some of the most famous people who were being executed, including King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. She described in her memoirs how she would be sitting there on the steps up to the guillotine, with the bloody head on her knees, taking wax impressions of their faces. The year after, in 1794, her mentor Philippe Curtius, he passes away and leaves his entire waxwork collection to Marie. And the year after that, in 1795, she married Francois Tussaud and had 2 sons. So it's all kind of coming together now. She's got the waxwork collection and now the name. I'm just going to put a note in here about pronunciations. As a British person, I've probably butchered all of the French names up to now anyway, but with a British accent, we call the brand Madame Tussauds. But Marie was a French woman, obviously, and so it's also just dawning on me now that you probably should say her name as Marie instead of Marie, but just go with it, okay? And so once she got married and took her husband's name, technically the pronunciation would have been Marie Tussauds. And either way you say it, this was not going to be a marriage that ended in a happily ever after. In 1802, Marie moved to the UK with one of her sons, Joseph, and her entire waxwork collection. And a short time after that, her other son, Francis, he joins his mum. Francois, she never sees him again once she leaves France in 1802. From there, Marie starts touring around the country with her waxwork exhibition, including those aristocratic death masks from the French Revolution. Turns out people were obsessed with her work, especially the more macabre exhibits. I wonder why. Not because it was overtly gory or sensationalized violence or anything like that, but because it was a visual representation of what went on based based in purely historical fact. I mean, they didn't have Netflix, they didn't have all of these dramatized documentaries or anything like that. This is what they had to learn about world events. And it just so happened that the public had this weird fascination with the darker side of humanity, and Marie was just perfectly placed to give them exactly what they wanted. The demand was clearly there, so much so that they actually set up a permanent home for the collection called the Baker Street Bazaar in London. And they'd got it set up in such a way where all of the particularly gruesome exhibits were off in a separate room. In 1846, Punch magazine refers to this separate room as the Chamber of Horrors. I mean, not wrong, but that name stuck. In 1850, Madame Tussauds passed away, but not before creating a wax model self-portrait of herself, which is now still on display in the London location along with her death mask. And it feels like a real full circle moment here, having her own death mask on display. I like it. The waxworks stay in the family though. Her sons continue to run the operation, and then her grandsons. And in 1884, they moved the attraction to Marylebone Road, which is still its home today. On the 18th of March 1925 though, a massive fire tore through Madame Tussauds, with witnesses saying that the red and gold flames leapt 50 feet from the roof of the building. And if that wasn't dramatic enough, people were saying that they could hear the wax models inside sizzling in the heat. It took 1.5 hours to get the fire under control, during which they obviously lost a lot of figures, resulting in some absolute nightmare fuel photos of half-burned wax corpses. But the whole top floor of the building was destroyed. There was obviously heavy water damage to the lower floors. They actually lost a bunch of Napoleonic artifacts, so the Emperor's coaches, and even the bed sheets from his deathbed too, they were completely destroyed. But if there are any silver linings to take out of this, no one was hurt and the building was insured. So take this as a reminder to check on your building's insurance policies. So they were able to rebuild what they needed to, and 3 years later, in 1928, the newly refurbished building was unveiled, which now included a restaurant and a cinema. But then as we get into 1940 and it's the Blitz during World War II, it's not a good time to be a building in London. And Madame Tussauds was actually damaged for a second time, this time by a bomb. They lost a lot of older figures and 352 head molds, which is basically like the master copy. Without those, you can't make any more wax models of them, so that's that. It's quite a big loss. And it's quite likely that a lot of those head molds would have been ones that Marie herself had made, or even her mentor, Philippe. The cinema was also destroyed. It was just devastation all around. But again though, they rebuilt, they got back on their feet. And as they moved through the 20th century, the brand was beginning to grow outside the confines of London. In 1972, they opened a second location in Amsterdam, and then they continued opening attractions all over the world. But the original site on Marylebone Road is still going as strong as ever. And it's from here that the Madame Tussauds ghost stories first start appearing. In the Stardome, which I think is what used to be the cinema, there has apparently been a particularly nasty entity reported. He appears as this tall, shadowy figure, but you can see that he's dressed in like 1930s style clothing. Think like the wool tweed suits, that sort of thing. But apparently if you see him, you'll lock eyes and just be completely paralysed, just frozen with fear. You can't look away from his face as it's just staring into your soul. Just utterly terrifying. And with this guy, we don't know specifically who he is or why he appears as this really negative, angry guy. But what I thought is really interesting to know about Madame Tussauds in London is that they also have a bunch of artefacts from history. And specifically in the context of this story, artefacts from a darker side of history. They have in their archives things like the dock from the Old Bailey, which they bought in the early 1900s. They've got Dennis Nielsen's TV set from his house where he committed his brutal murders, and it's allegedly the set where he would sit and watch TV with the bodies of his victims. There's the old toll bell, which would be rung out at Newgate Prison for every execution between 1775 and 1902, as well as the prison door. And there's also a guillotine blade from the French Revolution, which is believed to have been the same blade which removed Marie Antoinette's head. So, you know, pretty heavy stuff. And if you're a subscriber to the theory that objects can come with paranormal attachments, or at the very least soak up the energy of particularly traumatic events, then potentially you may be interested to know that a tweed suit was given to Madame Tussauds by none other than John Haig, also known as the acid bath murderer, convicted of killing 6 people. And in 1949, just before his execution, he'd bequeathed the museum with his suit and a pair of shoes. I mean, okay, so the decade was just a little bit off by 1, but it does leave the question, is the nasty entity in the Stardome something to do with John Haig? And maybe, potentially, his suit brought with him more than just the infamy of the case. The Chamber of Horrors in London, they're also said to be haunted too. There have been reports of a man who looks to be very shabbily dressed, looking looking pretty bedraggled wandering around this area. And some people believe he is an 18th century highwayman who may have stayed in this area or even actually died around here, but we don't have a name or anything like that. There have also been sightings of a young boy in this area, and this story is just so sad. He's said to be running around in an absolute blind panic. He's so scared, and I think he may have been picked up by mediums too, because some have come out and said that he seems to be worried about the war, and I think people piecing together the history of the building in the area and whatnot, they're wondering whether this boy maybe died in the Blitz with all the bombs being dropped in the area and maybe he doesn't realise. But there have also been heavy footsteps heard when no one is about, drops in temperature that can't be explained by air conditioning or anything like that. And there was another really weird story that I came across in my research. In 1983, while a woman called Karen was on the London Underground, she just so happened to snap a photo of her nephew. And when they got the photo developed, because this was before the time of digital cameras and all of that, there was something weird on this photo. The nephew was there, all happy, all smiling, all normal, but behind him there was a very weird image of a man, strapped into what looked to be an electric chair, with bolts of lightning shooting out of his hands. The thing is, this is an exact image of a waxwork in the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds, modelled on Bruno Hauptmann, the man who was convicted and executed by the electric chair for the 1932 abduction and murder of the Lindeberg baby. And this image, it looks to be outside the carriage, so you could think, oh, it's an advert in one of the tunnels advertising for Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors or something. But thinking about how fast the train moves through the tunnel, it's a super clear image. Could it have been an advert on the inside of the train? Potentially, but it looks a little bit big, because they're normally only in the top section above the window, so not sure. Plus, allegedly, Madame Tussauds came out and said that we've never used that waxwork model for any promotional material. Maybe they did and they just didn't mention it or forgot about it or whatever. I don't know. The photo was actually sent into the Society for Psychical Research, where none other than Maurice Grosse, the guy who was super involved in the Enfield poltergeist case, he looked into it. And when I first saw the initial few details for this story, I first thought, couldn't somehow, I don't really know how, but an image that had been taken at Madame Tussauds, could that get superimposed onto another image through like negatives or something? Apparently Maurice found that that couldn't have happened. Plus, it doesn't explain the lightning bolts, as they're not part of the Madame Tussauds display. And Karen claimed that she hadn't even gone to Madame Tussauds, so she couldn't have taken that picture. The story takes another turn when this Karen said that she went to visit a medium friend that she had. Apparently, with absolutely no prompting, no context, this friend immediately goes, "You're being followed by someone, and he's trying to tell you that he's being blamed for something that he didn't do. But this man wants you to know that he did do something else that the police don't know about." And so that's the story about how apparently an entity who may or may not be Bruno Hauptmann followed this woman. Personally, I feel like the photo is too weird and it's too clear. I think the addition of the lightning bolts too, that's got to be some sort of advert, surely. But let me know what you think about it, because it is a very weird story and it very much did pique my interest when I first saw it. But also worth mentioning with Madame Tussauds London that Most Haunted have investigated here, but from what I could watch of the investigation, it looks like they were more just psyching themselves out about the waxwork models rather than anything actually paranormal, so there's that. But still plenty of interesting stories, so let me know what you think. But for now, we're heading across the pond to the States. Because in 1999, the first American Madame Tussauds opens up in Las Vegas, of all places. And this site, it had an interesting story before Madame Tussauds was even in the picture, because back in 1952, the Sands Hotel opened its doors on this area of the Strip. And immediately, this was one of those hotels where it was the place to be for anyone who's anyone. And it's also considered the birthplace of the Rat Pack, the group consisting of Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., as well as Peter Lawford and Joey Bishop. They'd be performing at the Copa Room in the Sands Hotel, usually a cigarette and a drink in hand, and they kind of became the epitome of that Las Vegas vibe. But nothing lasts forever, especially in Vegas, and by the 90s, the Sands Hotel was in trouble. On the 30th of June 1996, the hotel shut its doors for good, and it was imploded in November of that same year, to make way for the newer hotel, the $1.5 billion resort, the Venetian Las Vegas. This opened up to guests in 1999, and I mean, this place is massive. It's been through various various expansions and things since opening, it now has upwards of like 7,000 guest rooms. 7,000! That is just huge. That's massive. And inside the Venetian is Madame Tussauds, which some visitors and staff firmly believe is also haunted. The faint sound of a piano playing in the distance has been heard, and it's one of those smooth, jazzy numbers that would have been the soundtrack to Vegas in the 50s and 60s. But apparently there's no piano anywhere near to where those sounds are heard. And I don't know, it's inside of a busy hotel. That one I can kind of believe could just be echoes coming from elsewhere, maybe just reverberating in weird ways or whatnot. But there is a lot more allegedly going on here. There was a guy called Kurt Main interviewed for Ghost Adventures when they investigated the attraction. And he was working in the kind of scare attraction bit of the museum, and he claimed to have a few weird encounters in this area. One day he was just getting on with his job, normal shift, all good, when he saw what he thought to be an old maintenance man just casually walk out of one of the bathrooms. He spotted him and obviously thought it was odd what he was wearing when he saw him walk off out of sight. Only after that, when he followed him, the guy had disappeared. And he's also apparently witnessed the apparition of a man in green trousers and a white shirt, looking fairly 1970s-esque. And Kurt watched this guy walk up some stairs. He doesn't recognise him, so he's not a colleague, and it must be a visitor or something, right? So he follows this guy because no one should be back here, going up these stairs, only to find that again, the guy in the green trousers completely vanishes. There's nowhere for him to go. Realistically, living people can't just vanish into thin air. The first time this happened, Kurt actually shrugged it off. He must be mistaken. Until the next day, the green trousers guy makes another appearance, and this time both Kurt and a colleague actually see him. And again, he walks off out of sight and disappears. But now it's a little harder to shrug off because they both definitely saw this guy. The disembodied sounds of groaning have also been heard in the area that was set up like a morgue. And I'm not sure if it's still all set up like that, if it's changed a little bit, but other people have also reported being touched in this area, which I'm not bothered by wax figures, mannequins, dolls, anything like that. I know some people are though, and I would absolutely join you and very quickly draw the line if I am walking through a wax museum, I feel someone brush past me and there's no one there. No, thank you. Hard pass. But it's not just areas where they've got it all set up as a creepy attraction thing. They've also got a room within the museum where there are wax figures of Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr. They're all set up like they're giving a performance at the Sands Hotel. And apparently, this room would have been in the same area where the Copa room in the Sands Hotel would have been. The same room where the Rat Pack would have taken to the stage. And so now, disembodied laughter, the sounds of glasses clinking together, all of these sounds, which seem like a crowd enjoying a great evening, they have all been heard when this room is completely empty. And then, just like any tourist attraction, once you're done with your visit to Madame Tussauds, you'll exit through the gift shop. And it's here that a woman called Stephanie had a very strange experience when she was closing up one night. And she was just milling about waiting for the last visitors to leave. And once they had, she was just about to radio over to her colleagues, telling them that everyone had gone and it was time to lock up and all of that, when she started hearing faint music, which was getting louder and louder. Okay, bit weird, but it's a hotel. Lots of ambient noises, you know? She started walking towards the noise anyway. I mean, you've got to check it out, and it's coming from behind a set of double doors within the attraction. She reaches these doors and pulls them open, and as soon as she does that, she's hit with a ridiculously cold chill, colder than just an AC draft or anything like that. And the music is just as loud as anything, so loud that she immediately recognises it as an Elvis Presley song. No explanation for where this noise or this chill is coming from, and there's no one in this room, nothing. And so it is just another interesting, if maybe a little coincidental connection, but apparently Elvis saw Freddie Bell and the Bell Boys perform Hound Dog at the Sands Hotel, and that performance inspired him to record his own version of the song. So it would have been interesting to know what song Stephanie actually heard, and it might be a bit of a reach, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. And so with the weird activity that's claimed at the Las Vegas Madame Tussauds location, some people are adamant that you may well run into something more than just creepy wax figures during your visit. And 10 years after this Las Vegas attraction opened in 2009, the fourth American Madame Tussauds opened its doors in Hollywood. I mean, really, where better to open a waxworks with a bunch of celebrities than in a town full of celebrities? Although, really interesting to point out that there already was a wax museum in Hollywood. Literally a 2-minute walk down the street from where Madame Tussauds Hollywood is now. Although, both seem to be doing quite fine, so, you know, all good there. It is just funny, of all the things that you can have, you have 2 wax museums on the same street. Although I do think Madame Tussauds refers to itself as an attraction rather than a museum. Anyway, obviously that area is pretty recently developed. The building itself was a brand new building, although it does sit right next to the TCL Chinese Theatre, which you might know it as the iconic Grauman's Chinese Theatre, which opened in 1927. And so it's quite interesting that unexplainable activity has been heard in this location too. On the Spirit of Hollywood floor, which has wax figures of people like Marilyn Monroe, Charlie Chaplin and Judy Garland, staff have heard footsteps echoing about even when there's no one around. It should be totally quiet. Some people claim to have seen shadow figures darting around between the displays, which is super disconcerting. Some staff are adamant that they've seen the wax figure's eyes follow them around the room when they're the only ones in there. And as terrifying as that sounds, like yes, that is definitely the start of a very good horror movie trope. I'm inclined to think that that might be more to do with being in a room alone with waxwork figures and your own imagination rather than anything else. But in the Marvel Theatre, an actual apparition has apparently been seen by staff. They describe him as a man wearing overalls, looking like he's just clocking in for a shift as the maintenance guy. Only when staff follow him into the theatre, because he does look out of place, they go in to find that he's completely disappeared. Nowhere for him to have ducked out, he's just vanished into thin air. Could he be something to do with the Chinese theatre next door though? As that is apparently haunted too, with stories there being that a little girl haunts the building, but also a stagehand who allegedly commits suicide behind the screen. It's a theory, potentially, but who knows? And then there's also the rumours around the wax figure of Audrey Hepburn. Because she's got a bit of a reputation around her, both visitors and staff claim that the model itself has been moved into different positions when no one's around. And apparently, some guests have even heard her talking to them when they sit next to her. As she's all set up in that famous breakfast at Tiffany's pose, staff members will sometimes be opening up in the morning after the building has been locked up completely overnight, no one has been in, and they will find things from the table that she's sitting at have been flung a decent distance away from the table. And so it seems like it doesn't matter how new the attraction is, there's still the potential there for strange goings on. But with all of these alleged ghost stories surrounding Madame Tussauds attractions, is it to do with the attraction itself? And by that I'm asking whichever side of the fence you sit on, that it is all just in their heads and the imaginations are getting the best of people, or that these wax figures themselves are actually responsible for paranormal activity. Or is it to do with the location that Madame Tussauds just so happens to now occupy, and it's more to do with the buildings that came before it? Or is it all just a mixed bag of sorts? I think potentially some locations could be haunted, but most likely more by what the site has been used for in the past. So for Las Vegas, the energetic imprint of the Sands Hotel and how influential that was to Vegas at the time. And then for London, the history of the museum on its own. Madame Tussauds' own grandsons moved into that location, so it would have contained figures that she herself created. And then all of the clothing and the artifacts, I do believe that they can stir up some energy. Especially with things like an actual guillotine blade. Even if it wasn't the one that took Marie Antoinette's head, it still took other people's lives, you know? But then, along with all of that, there is a massive asterisk with it all, in that some people do find dolls, wax figures, all of that very creepy. They're already going to be on edge, and so imagination has most likely got a lot to do with it. But let me know your thoughts, your opinions, I want to hear them. I also think it is a funny little connection, not really anything in the slightest, but Wookey Hole and Warwick Castle, they've both been owned by Madame Tussauds at one time or another, and they are both locations that I've covered on the channel before. But if you enjoyed this video, please do make sure you hit the like button, and if you want to hear more stories like this, it would be very cool to have you around for another one, so maybe subscribe too if you fancy it. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Thank you for the sustenance. I'm having a cookie break. Mr. DSC is on a baking hype at the minute, and so we're getting homemade bread, got cookies, apple pies. It's been great in our house.